Hello, I'm Mark. Welcome to Nate Sutan. Well, we're now in the fall rotation for the progression of the show, and I hope that you've been enjoying the Gnostic Gospel as we've been going through it. It's actually been on this now for, maybe 8-10 months. It's been a long time, but being such a tome of a book, I wanted to make sure that I plugged all the way through it, and we are working our way. We're more than halfway through it. The last time we had taped the show, it was the last episode of the summer rotation, and now we're starting the first episode of the fall rotation. And I wanted to put a nice little bow on the origin of the world. It's another Gnostic telling of the Genesis narrative. Now, mind you, as I said in the last show, I'm not actually falling on either side of the idea of like an actual event of Genesis historically happening or not happening. I'm just trying to present the idea of like the Gnostic take on what the Genesis story might have been. Now, in our last show, I had, spoken about the idea that much of the Genesis narrative and parts of the Genesis story parallel the Genesis narrative that all Christians, or most Christians, should be familiar with. You know, the idea of God creating the earth in 6 days and creating Adam and Eve, and the provocative thought that, in some ways, I don't think that it's beyond, or I don't think that it's unreasonable to guess. If there was an original narrative, its origins, from where it might have come, which came first, whether it was the Christian Genesis narrative that we're all familiar with, or the Genesis narrative that you might find in variation in the Gnostic Gospels. The provocative point is, if one came before the other, or they were, created around the same time and parallel each other, they have so many different points that they say the exact same thing. I don't think it's beyond reason to speculate that they might have been borrowing from one, like did the Gnostics take the original Genesis narrative that we're all familiar with as Christians and add to it, like the characters of Yaldabaoth and Sophia Pista, or did the Gnostics have variations on the Genesis narrative with this idea of a overfather of pure light, and then Pista Sophia, which is faith wisdom, and her daughter Pistis Zoe, which is faith life. These are the characters that were supposed to have been in this etheric realm that descended down into the physical realm, and then the creation of the earth. Just as a brief overview, the son of Pistis Sophia, faith wisdom, was said to be Yaldabaoth, and Yaldabaoth was said to be the one that created the earth itself. This is in the Gnostic narrative. As I said, I don't think it's beyond reason to speculate, and I know this is pure speculation. I'm by no means a biblical scholar, but which one came first and which one might have borrowed from the other, added to or taken away from. Now, just as a point of a little bit of an overview, we're almost done with this section of origins of the world. There's probably about 6 more sections that I wanted to go over, and it brings up some pretty provocative thoughts about Gnostic explanation of where the universe came from, its origins, which way it's going, humans' place in it, and its ultimate end. So I just want to touch on some of those points in the sections that I found here. And as I said, just as a brief overview to touch upon, there is in the Genesis narrative that you'll find for this section of the Gnostic Gospels, there is what is called the infinite one, or the monad. And the monad is the one that's above everything. It's beyond conception. It's the infinite light. And this infinite light existed, and from this infinite light descended the infinite light's daughter, for lack of a better way to put it, which is called Pistis Sophia, which is Greek for faith wisdom. And Pistis Sophia had, had a daughter, which is Pistis Zoe, faith life. Now, from Pistis Sophia sprung her son Yaldabaoth. And Yaldabaoth is, and this is where it gets very controversial, Yaldabaoth in the Genesis story is God in the Christian story. For example, when Adam, and this is where I'm going to start off with, in the section where it says, have you eaten from the tree? Now, one of the reasons I had left off here, but I'm actually starting off at a very provocative point, because the light that these main characters of this part of the narrative are cast in is very, very, it is a radical departure from what we're familiar with in the Genesis narrative in the Christian Bible, so the King James Bible and on. So, if the son of Pistis Sophia is Yaldabaoth, Yaldabaoth had what they call the powers that were with him. And they had what they rose up to the powers, rose up to their place, but then they descended down to the earth and they interacted with Adam. Yaldabaoth had made the shell of Adam. He made the body, he made the physical body, but his mother Pistis Sophia had actually blown spirit into Adam and made him animated. This is, again, just a Genesis narrative from the Gnostic perspective. Again, I know that there might be some that are scoffing at the idea because especially with a Christian background and how radical the departure is. But again, mind you, these narratives are as old as the narrative that we're all familiar with as Christians. You know, they're variations on the story. And the main point is there's variations on the story. So even though one might want to claim that their version of the story is true, let's say, for instance, as a Christian, the way that it's told in Genesis, in any Christian Bible, doesn't necessarily mean only the strength of your conviction is the strongest selling point for the idea. There is no way to prove or disprove that version is actually true, which is, you know, I mean, again, to say that the Genesis narrative is an actual historic event poses some very big problems for those who believe in that idea. That's why, and of course, again, at its root, Gnosticism is very much enmeshed in and immersed in the idea of allegoric content, the allegory of the tale. So they're not telling it from an idea of where they're saying this was a historical event. It's just an allegoric explanation of how we got here. So as I've laid out these particular characters, Yaldabaoth being the son of Pistis Sophia in Gnosticism was actually the God or the Yahweh in the Christian story. And, you know, I could go into wide and varied speculation about the idea that perhaps for one reason, maybe hypothetically speaking, if the Gnostic narrative came first, and it's got all these different characters and taking all sorts of different positions, it would stand to reason that Christianity, when it was trying to push its version of the story, of the Genesis narrative all the way up through, might streamline it and strip out some of these characters and make it more simplified. Simplified for those that they're trying to, you know, we're pushing towards conversion. Because a big part of, you know, a pillar of the Christian belief system is converting the non-believers into the Christian belief and accepting the Lord Jesus Christ as Savior and picking up that banner. Again, the very controversial parts. And some reasons why, like say for instance in the Gnostic Gospels, it talks about the idea of a separation of darkness and light. And it makes it a little bit easier to understand why Jesus had an appeal for the Gnostics among dozens upon dozens of other things when he kept making references to darkness and light. And the idea of light being understanding, like turning a light on in a crowded room so that that's jammed with furniture so you can navigate your way around it. I know it's a poor metaphor, but the point is, for the Gnostics, the idea of light and dark meant the difference between the gnosis, self-exploration, the knowing, and the darkness of this ignorance they say that every person was immersed into. So, moving forward with that, and as I said, these sections are very controversial, and there's going to be many people that disagree with it, but I think it's fascinating to put it on the table. At the very least, to understand how the Gnostics perceived what their worldview was up through the reason why Jesus was here, what at the core, what he was trying to teach. So looking at, say for instance, at this part, as I had read from the last show, and I stopped at the part where Adam and Eve had eaten from the tree. So, and again, there's parallels that you'll find in the Christian Bible that are also almost exact to the Gnostic narrative of the story, with some variations, some significant variations that I think are intriguing. So, Adam and Eve ate from the tree, and the rulers knew that Adam and Eve had transgressed their commandments. They entered paradise, and this is the thing, they put it in the context of the rulers. Interesting, in the Genesis narrative, and I mentioned this on the last show, when God was walking through the garden and he was looking for Adam, and Adam was hiding, and Adam said that he'd eaten from the tree, and he said Eve had given him the fruit to eat from the tree. God said, and you can find this in any Bible, pick up any King James Bible or Gideon or any variation on the New Testament, you'll find that God is referring to himself in the plural when God says he wishes to be like us, or they wish to be like us. And it's very interesting. That's very telling. And it's part of the reason why I might try to correlate some of these ideas about which narrative might have come first, the Gnostic narrative in comparison to the Christian narrative. Now, I know that Christian apologists have said that one of the arguments I've heard, one question of why God would refer to himself in the plural when he says, when Adam ate from the tree, that they wish to be like us, is that God was no more than referring to the idea of the Father and Son and Holy Spirit, or the Trinity. But what's telling, and I think it's very interesting, is in the Gnostic story, there's Yaldabaoth and all the rulers that travel around with him. There's like 6 or 7 of them. So when Yaldabaoth and the rulers come down and they ask, that you ate from the tree, and Adam and Eve said, yes, they did, it actually makes more sense in this story where Yaldabaoth would say they wish to be like us. Because in their story, there is a plurality of rulers. There is a Yaldabaoth and all those the rulers that travel with him. So in this context, it seems to make more sense of why they wish to be like us would be spoken in a plural, where it needed to be explained in the Christian narrative when God said they wish to be like us. That's why I'm saying I think that it's interesting where who might have borrowed from who. So. And here's another radical departure from the characters, particularly here, and what I'm talking about now is a serpent, the snake. When Adam and Eve were very much disturbed and hid under a tree in paradise, the rulers did not know where they were. Adam, where are you? He said, I am here. But because of the fear of you, I hid after I became ashamed. But they said to him in ignorance, who is the one who spoke to you of shame to put on these, unless you ate from the tree? He said, the woman who gave this to me, so Adam said Eve gave it to him, she is the one who gave it to me and I ate. And the woman said, what is this you have, and they said, what is this you have done to Eve? And she answered, the instructor is the one who incited me and I ate. Radical departure. The serpent here in this story is called the instructor. He's benign. The serpent is a benign character that wants to teach Adam and Eve. And again, the same narrative is written. When you flip open any Bible, the Genesis story, it says the serpent says to Eve, did God really tell you that you would die if you ate from the tree? Of course you won't die. You're not going to die if you eat from it. And his tone is interpreted as challenging or sinister, for lack of a better way to put it, in the Christian narrative. In the Gnostic story, when the serpent says, or the instructor says to Eve, it's more of a benign, fatherly kind of advice. It says, no, the instructor or the rulers tell you that you will die if you eat from this tree, but it's not true if you eat from that you'll die. You won't. Your eyes will be open to good and evil. And he is a very much painted as a benign character in the Gnostic gospel. So that's, as I said, one example of a very radical departure from what we're familiar with in the Christian version of the story. Now, the next part I thought was really interesting is this next part, and try to expound upon it for a second. I'm just going to read this one chapter. Now, when the rulers saw that Adam had acquired a different knowledge, they wanted to test him. They gathered all the domestic animals and wild beasts of the earth and the birds of the heaven and brought them to Adam to see what he called them. When he saw them, he gave them names to these creatures, which again is very familiar with the Genesis narrative we're familiar with. Adam named all the animals. After he ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he named the animals in the Genesis story. Before he ate from the tree, if I remember correctly, in any Christian Bible, he named all the animals before he ate from the tree. But in this story, the rulers that be tested him to see what he had learned, what he had acquired in eating from the tree of knowledge, and he he showed what he had learned by naming all the different animals. Now, and here's where it gets very interesting. They were troubled because Adam had sobered up from his ignorance. And here in a footnote, it says his trials. So is the ignorance or the trials that he had been through. They gathered together and took counsel and said. So this would be Yaldabaoth and all the rulers that run with him or move with him. And this is where it gets very provocative. Look, Adam has become like one of us, so that he understands the difference between light and darkness. Now perhaps he will be deceived as with the tree of knowledge, and will come to the tree of life and eat from it and become immortal and rule and condemn us and us and regard us and all our glory as folly. And then he will pass judgment on us in the word. Come, let us cast him out of paradise down to earth, the place from where he was taken, so that he will be no longer able to do anything better than we can. So they cast Adam and his wife out of paradise. And of course, it did the same things that God has said to have done in the Genesis story. He set cherubim, fiery living things called cherubim around the gates, a sword, a flaming sword that pointed in every direction. They would keep Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden. But here's where it's incredibly provocative and controversial. For any person that has been through Sunday school and knows the Genesis story, from what we're all be familiar with, for what we were raised in the Christian background, when Adam and Eve ate from the tree, the snake deceived them, and God in righteous anger threw them out of the garden. He stopped them from eating from the tree of life for their own protection, as the way that the story unfolds, and threw them out of the Garden of Eden, and he put a flaming sword up and pointing in every direction to stop them, Adam and Eve from getting back into heaven, or back into paradise. God also cursed the woman and the snake and the man, but and here they have a variation on it to where they say that the Yaldabaoth and the powers could really do no harm to the instructor or the serpent, so all they could do was curse at him. This is how the Gnostic story unfolds. But what I wanted to point out was, again, going back a little bit, what has been portrayed for our Christian background, my Catholic background, for any Christian background, the expulsion from Eden. It was done by a forward-thinking, righteous God who, partially in anger and partially to protect Adam and Eve, threw them out of the Garden of Eden before they could eat from the tree of life. That is how the story is presented. And of course, moving forward to the idea of Jesus' life, this is where it all links in together. Because Adam and Eve ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, this is what is called the fall, what causes us to have original sin, and why we need Jesus' blood to wash away the taint of that sin. This is, the origin of the story, building forward up to accepting Jesus Christ as your own personal Savior. What makes it so very interesting here is, as the Gnostics explain the story, the powers that be, Yaldabaoth and the rulers, cast Adam and Eve out of heaven because they were afraid of them. They cast them out of heaven because they were afraid of what Adam and Eve would become, even more powerful than them, and recognized them as fools and as a demiurge, or as not even close to the monad. So in the Gnostic story, it was done out of fear that God, Yahweh, Yaldabaoth, and the powers that be cast Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden. And I think that, again, a very radical departure, because the serpent is no more than an instructor who's got a benign reasoning behind his instructions to Adam and Eve. And the bad guy in the story is Yaldabaoth and the powers that be that travel with him, who are trying to trick Adam and Eve and control them. And they threw them out of the Garden of Eden before they could eat from the tree of life. Now, as I had done a simple overview and I read that part about have you eaten from the tree, there is another section here about phoenixes, water animals, and bulls of Egypt. And without reading the whole section, because I don't want to gum up the process, there is one part that I want to point out to where in the Gnostic story, and the Gnostic version of what they think the components of what makes up the human being, they likened humans in some ways to the phoenix. And this is the idea of birth and death and then resurrection and rebirth. They said like a worm here. And the worm that is brought forth from the phoenix is also a human being. It is written of it. They just sprout like the phoenix. The phoenix first appears alive and dies and rises again. A sign of what appears at the consummation of the age. Now, again, I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but the point is, the Gnostics saw the human soul, the human spirit, is kind of like a phoenix. You know, they say it was like a worm, small like a worm. But when it grew through the Gnostic process, it exploded out like the phoenix. And the parts that were detrimental to the consciousness fell away in a death, as it were, and the resurrection of the consciousness that always has been, that will move back to God and cleave to God again, rises like the phoenix and moves towards the monad, or that one all-father that is above everything. The next section I want to get into, and it's called Error and Ignorance Enter Human History. Now, it's kind of complicated. The story is essentially the Gnostics take on what brought humans to perceive and conceive as they did. And it goes in, 3 and 4 and 5 different directions. So I'm going to try and dovetail it down so that I don't make it too convoluted or too complicated to be able to follow. And in some ways, too, it's also a Gnostic critique of the Christian method to approach God. At least that's what I was able to call from what I was reading. But again, one of the important things to remember is, since they use such rich allegoric content, when they name particular nouns, as it were, characters and figures, they're allegory sometimes for something else. So let me just read down through this first, it's not that big, but I'll read down through like at least the first paragraph, and then try to like deconstruct what I can, and at least unravel some of it. And it is error and ignorance enter the human history. Let us come back to the rulers of whom we speak, that we might present an explanation of them. For when the 7 rulers were cast from the heavens, that would be the 7 rulers with Yaldabaoth, down to earth, they created for themselves angels, many demonic angels to serve them, demonic angels. But these demons taught humankind many errors with magic and potions and idolatry, and shedding of blood, and altars and temples and sacrifices, and libations to all demons of the earth. Having as their co-worker, and this is where it gets incredibly provocative and just to try to deconstruct it, having as their co-worker fate, who came into being according to the agreement by the gods of injustice and justice. And thus when the world came into being, it wandered astray into distraction throughout all time. For all the people who are on the earth serve the demons from the creation to the consummation of the age, both the angels of justice and people of injustice. Thus the world came to be in distraction and ignorant and stupor. They all erred until the appearance of the true human, which the appearance of the true human would probably be, I would guess, would probably be like Jesus. There's a chance that the true human they're talking about, or the first true human, would be like Jesus. But you're welcome, sweetheart. Just talking to my daughter in the control booth. Again, this is like this is a really big ball to try and deconstruct. It seems that the Gnostics are explaining what brought humans to where they are. We're talking about, humans in a civilized sense, humans in their everyday life, humans in their perception. I had said a long time ago that the Bible seems to be no more than a constant contending with God. With all the different characters we have in the Bible, whether it's Jacob, or we have Job, or we have Lot, or we have Jonah, all the way up to Jesus, there seems to be a contention with God. We contend with God. We contend with God about what we think is fair and unfair. Now, I would ask you, the viewer at home, to take the word God out of the sentence that I just said and put in the word life, or put in the word existence. Human history is a constant contention with life. It's a constant contention with what we think is fair and unfair. To follow this train of thought, what I'm trying to spell out and put on the table is the idea that when they said the idea about Yaldabaoth and powers being cast down to earth, and they created demons and angels and stuff, I don't think that because they're so rich in allegoric meaning, don't necessarily think that they meant physical autonomous creatures, but parts of thought, thoughts of a thought process. An idea or a thought has a life of its own. Like, say, for instance, contemporary terms. Being Democratic or being a Republican. All the tenets that go along with that particular political bent or political thought, it takes on almost like an autonomous life of its own. People become Republicans because of the basic tenets of being a Republican. And I don't want to reach too far afield for an example, but my point is, when they say the idea of angels and demons that come down, I think that it's more of an allegory for human concepts of how we quantify the world. Now, the reason why I put it in that context is because it says that these demons taught humankind many errors with magic and potions and idolatry and shedding of blood and altars and temples and sacrifices and libations to all the demons of the earth. The earliest form of worship was sun worship. It was praying to the deity of the sun and trying to gain the deity's favor. And why do we want to obtain the deity's favor? Humans are thrust into a medium. Humans are thrust into a medium of existence where fair things and unfair things happen, and sometimes people suffer and die, and sometimes children die. And there are many poor people who suffer and a few rich people that have it all. And sometimes we go hungry, and sometimes we're cruel to each other. We're all these different things. In some ways, the Gnostics have taken the idea of eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil as the time or the starting point for when humans started projecting upon existence their own scale or expectations of what was just and what was unjust. And the reason why the word fate was thrown into there too was because when we perceive what we think is just and unjust, we perceive a fair fate or an unfair fate, or what should happen or what shouldn't happen. This is the contention that I'm talking about. When I say that all these characters from the Bible are contending with God, they're contending with existence. What we think is fair, what we think is unfair, what we think is just, what we think is unjust. So what do? When we quantify and personify existence, and say that at its pinnacle and at its point, there is a deity, there is a God, there is an entity that has created it all. And we need to curry this deity's favor so that justice will be on our side and it will be served, and our fates will be ultimately to go to this place of eternal pleasure in comparison to the judgment that goes to eternal suffering. Humans conceptualize justice and injustice and the fate that goes along with it, and when we personified it into a God, and again, this moves forward into some of the greatest challenges that Jesus had during his ministry. We quantify this idea about appeasing or appealing to deity to curry favor or justice or injustice through the means of, and it says here, taught humankind's many errors. So this is many errors of human thinking. Magic potions, idolatry, shedding of blood, altars and temples and sacrifices and libations to all demons of the world. In some ways, this is a brief summation of the three approaches that we have for trying to appease deity or trying to appease God. We do it legalistically with the 613 laws of Moses. We do it sacrificially, which of course the greatest sacrifice was Jesus dying on the cross and the shedding of his blood so that we might gain favor with God, so that he might be able to get back into heaven again, or ritualistically, which for any Catholic would know about stand up, sit down, eat the Eucharist, the 12 stations of the cross, all those different approaches. But these three approaches to deity, to appeasing God, is in many ways the greatest part of Jesus' ministry. Now, again, I'm speaking from someone, or at least as I'm guessing, from what a Gnostic may have been seeing in Jesus in comparison to those who he ran afoul of, or those he challenged, or those that followed him. Jesus was constantly challenging the Pharisees. He was constantly challenging the givers of the law. There are a myriad stories in the New Testament in Jesus' ministry where it is, let he is without sin cast the first stone. Give to Caesar what is owed to Caesar. Do not make my Father's house a temple for the change. turning over the change tables. All those different things, Jesus was challenging the status quo of these approaches to God, the sacrificial approaches to God, the legalistic approaches to God. And Jesus was saying to many of these people that were doing these things, you're not getting it. You're missing the forest despite the tree. These things that you're done are human folly. These things of the legalistic and the ritualistic and the sacrificial. To the Gnostic, Jesus was calling them out on these things because he was pointing in one direction. And this was in the Gospel of Thomas. In the Gospel of Thomas, it said, the kingdom of heaven is inside you and all around you. So only through the Gnostic process, the internalization of the process and the gradual growing in wisdom and understanding, does one come to cleave to God again. The Gnostics saw Jesus saying to those who were purveyors of the legalistic approach or the sacrificial or ritualistic that they were fools, and they weren't going to get any closer to God than from where they started. And the only way that they were going to get to God was by internalizing and accepting the fact that they were sons of God too, and the Christ consciousness was alive and aware inside of every individual person. So, as I said, this section almost seems to a critique of, like if the Gnostics were to say that they believe that we came from this particular starting point and we move forward, this section here about taught humans many errors seems to almost be like a Gnostic critique of what they saw the more orthodox in their approach to God doing. And that's why they also ended it with the world came to be in distraction, ignorance, and stupor. Well, what's the opposite of distraction and ignorance and stupor? Awareness, gnosis, the particular growth and spiritual heightened levels of awareness, and I know I use the word again, that one might acquire if they follow the Gnostic process. This is the antidote for it. But they attribute, even though I say it's in allegoric terms, the idea of a ritualistic or sacrificial or legalistic approach as ideas that come from demons, which would be, again, allegorically, could be no more than construed as, not as autonomous characters, but as corrupt thought. So that section, it's important they put that section there about error and ignorance enter human history, because if you build up that premise, at least from a Gnostic perspective, then as you move forward in the next explanations, which I think are very, very interesting, because there's only 2 pages left on this, but in these 2 pages is a lot packed into it. The blessed innocent spirit is no more than the idea that there are innocent spirits in the world and they teach people, kind of like the Buddhist idea of the bodhisattvas. The sages and the teachers and the rabbis that are out, the senseis, all the different teachers that are around, that teach people to move towards enlightenment. So the Gnostics believe that, for one, ignorance and error enter human history, and it's apparent in those approaches that they saw the Orthodox that they were surrounded by using to try and get to God, and not gnosis was the way to get to God. And within this walking, waking world, there were blessed spirits that were around that could help one, and there was in individual people as we try to absorb wisdom and understanding from each other, truly learning to listen to each other, truly learning to hear each other, truly trying to grow instead of imposing our will upon another through the sacrificial or ritualistic or legalistic. Because this is the thing, from a sociological perspective, say for one example, let he who's without sin cast the first stone. You have to dehumanize a person that way, to believe so much in a legalistic interpretation of a way to approach God, that you have to take this person and you have to dehumanize them and make them worthy of death. And Jesus was pointing out that, let he who's without sin cast the first stone, that you are no more than she is. You are the same as she is. Or as it says in Buddhism, I see Buddhas everywhere. But Jesus was pointing it out in a negative. This is the sin, as it were, the missing of the mark, or the contemptible evil that one might find in the world. We use our religious belief, and especially history is rich in example of these 3 approaches of the legalistic or ritualistic or sacrificial, to flog each other, to beat each other, to dehumanize each other. And Jesus came along and said that as long as you're going to use these 3 things to try to approach God, you're always going to, 1, miss finding God, and 2, be incredibly inhuman and cruel to each other. And the only way that you're going to develop the humanity that you need to move towards God and to see Buddhas everywhere is by internalizing the process, by gaining gnosis. For the Gnostics, this was at the core of Jesus' teaching. So, and you know, these next three sections, one is Jesus is the Logos, all right? And it's, now the Word who is more exalted than everyone was sent from it for this work only to announce what is unknown. He said there is nothing hidden that will not appear, and what was unknown will be known. And that it can be found in Matthew 10:26, Mark 4:22, Luke 8:17 and 12:2, and in the Gospel of Thomas. So again, it's not as if they were creating something new that Jesus said. It's just the Gnostics took things that are very familiar to Orthodox Christians and had a very distinct interpretation of it that was in many ways very removed from the Orthodox interpretation. Now there were those sent so they might reveal what is hidden and expose the seven authorities of chaos and their impiety. They were fashioned to condemn and kill. So when all the perfect ones appeared in the fashioned bodies of the rulers and revealed incomparable truths, they put to shame every wisdom of the gods, and their fate was discovered to be condemnable. Their power dried up, their dominion was destroyed, and their forethought and their glory became empty. It seems, and I may be wrong about this, and I'm using essentially a contrast and compare. Because for some of my viewers at home who may be staunch Orthodox Christians, who will not be swayed from their belief system, fine, that's where you are. This is what you believe. Immerse yourself in it. That's fine. I'm offering a different take on what people thought Jesus, his purpose was, and the direction you're going, and what his dictates were for what this end time was. I bring this up because it seems that the next section is called the consummation of the age and the apocalypse. So for the Gnostics, they had a consummation of the age and end times, an apocalypse as it were. But this is what makes it distinctively different and very, very interesting. The world had reached a point of corruption from an Orthodox perspective, to where the only Son of God needed to come back to the world and be sacrificed so that his blood might be shed, so that all of humanity would be saved. So that if a person accepted Jesus Christ as their own personal Savior, they would achieve paradise, and if not, of course, they would be cast into the lake of fire for all eternity. This was the seminal moment. Jesus came back to die for our sins. The Gnostics' take was this. Jesus coming back marked the starting point. And this is, again, where it's very interesting because it's such a departure. Jesus coming back and the Word, or the Logos coming back into the world, marked the starting point. And the starting point, and this is where one has to call patience with the idea and be a little bit more expansive in the concept. The Word finally came back into the world as it expressed to a particular man. When it was expressed to this particular man, because it had finally come back into the world, the signpost was planted. Once the signpost was planted, it was now every individual person's responsibility to move back towards the wisdom. Before the time that he was here, or the Logos, the Word was in the world, we continued to bump around in the dark. We continued to wallow in what they call the fog and fear and terror, ignorance. Once Jesus came back into the world, the starting point was set off. Now, when I put it in the context of an apocalyptic take, because in a lot of ways, the Gnostic apocalypse is much more cheery than the Christian one, I have to say. From what I read in here, they have much more of a optimistic outcome for the end times than, say, the Christians do. And just to expound upon that for a little bit, because I still have about 15 minutes to go. There's an idea of critical mass. An idea of critical mass in the context of, say, for instance, this table here represented all of humanity. There are 7.5 billion people on the planet. And every one of those people on the planet represents a speck or a dot inside of the circumference of this table. Every person that gains gnosis, every person that gains awareness, every person that wakes up becomes a speck that turns on like a light. So, as over these past 2,000 years, through our struggles, through our trials, through our errors, the starting point was set. The Logos came back into the world as an express through man, and he planted the signpost that pointed home. Every individual person through a succession of lifetimes is gradually becoming a speck that lights up. So this table, even though most of it was dark with a couple of sections there where there were little sparks of light, gradually becomes more and more and more lit up as more and more people of the 7.5 billion or however many consciousnesses that there are in the great vast universe, I don't know, till it comes to a point of critical mass. Humanity will wake up one by one on an individual basis, and when they start to wake up, it will reach a point of critical mass that will cause, and again, the consummation of the age and the apocalypse. Think of it in the context again of light and dark, and why for the Gnostics it was so appealing when Jesus used the terminology. The demiurge creator, Yaldabaoth, and his rulers are said to be here. And these are all the negative ideas. These are all the negative aspects of humanity. These are all the things that cause the division and the darkness in humanity. To reach critical mass, for every human being to become awake and aware, for every human being to gain gnosis on an individual level through a succession of lifetime, my process, your process, any other person's process, for what is undone in them, and that's a highly individualized thing, must be overcome for that person to become aware too, to light up. When that person lights up and it reaches critical mass, what happens is they say that, and again, much of the same imagery, their kings will be drunk from the flaming sword and will make war against one another, so that the earth will be drunk from the blood that is poured out, and the seas will be troubled by that war. Then the sun will darken and the moon will lose its light. The stars of heaven will disregard their course, and great thunder will come out of great power, and that above all, of chaos, the place where the firmament of the woman is situated. Now, when they say the firmament of the woman, they're talking about Pistis Sophia, who is, again, came from the monad. She is faith, wisdom, and she is above. She is closest to the ineffable God that cannot be named or conceptualized. When she created the first word, she takes off her wise flame of afterthought and put it on a rational wrath. Then she will drive out the gods of chaos, whom she created together with the chief creator. So she is said to have created the gods of chaos with Yaldabaoth, the chief creator. She will cast them down to the abyss. They will be wiped out by their own injustice, for they will become like the mountains that blaze out fire. Sorry, my earplug is a little off on me. Please excuse me. And they will consume one another until they are destroyed by the chief creator, would be Yaldabaoth. When he destroys them, he will turn against himself and destroy himself until he ceases to be. And the heavens will fall upon one another, and their powers will burn. Their realms will be overthrown, and the chief creator's heaven will fall and split in two. Likewise, his star in their sphere will fall down to the earth, and the earth will not be able to support them. They will fall down to the abyss, and the abyss will be overthrown. And it's not the very last section. The light will cover the darkness and obliterate it. So the idea is when humanity reaches this critical mass, and again, to contrast it, the Orthodox Christian belief is that one day, and it could happen any time, many people believe that we're living in the end times, that the man Jesus is going to come back down on a cloud. And again, this appeal to the idea of justice and injustice and the idea of fate, it goes right in line with what the Gnostic critique was. Because ultimately, a fundamental Christian's belief is that Jesus will come back and the books will be settled. The book of life is said to be open. And any name that is written into the book of life will go to heaven. And any name that is not written in the book of life, the person will go to hell. In many ways, this is the ultimate expression of the human grasping of the idea of justice and injustice. Because in the Christian narrative, their ultimate end is the settling of justice and injustice, the fate of. And the critique from the Gnostics was, again, you're seeking it in the folly of justice and injustice when you're contending with life. You're saying what you think is good and what you think is evil, and you say that Jesus will come back and eventually right everything, and it'll be a new heaven and a new earth. And again, there's critiquing for that too, because when one believes in the idea of a new heaven and a new earth one day, then you're forgetting about the existence that you have right here and right now. And this right here and right now in existence is the only time that really matters, because this is the only time you could do anything about what you know or what you don't know. If you if you hit your wagon to the star of the idea that one day, someday, in the future, we don't know when, but soon, Jesus is coming, then you lay waste and lay waste for the day that you're in. And for the Gnostics, that was folly, because it was a day that you could have been spending gaining gnosis. Contributing and doing your part to the overall totality of humanity to reach this critical mass, which would blot out the darkness that is the rulers in Yaldabaoth. Because for the Gnostics, it seems that when humanity reaches this critical mass of gnosis, and we all wake up and we all become light, then we crush the darkness. We crush Yaldabaoth, we crush the rulers. They will eventually be obliterated, and there will be nothing but light. And this is the last section. The light is saved and Gnostics return home. The light will cover the darkness and obliterate it. It will become like something that never existed. And the source of the darkness will be dissolved. The deficiency will be plucked out of its root and thrown down to the darkness. And the light will withdraw up to its root, which in some ways has some Kabbalistic connotations to it, because the tree of life in Kabbalah is like upside down. So you go from the top of the tree, which is upside down, up to the root, which is closest to God. But I'm getting into, I don't want to get too sidetracked on that idea. And the glory of the unconceived will appear, and it will fill all the eternal realms. When the prophetic utterances in the writings of those who are rulers, which is the prophets and the writings many designated to be the books of the Hebrew, are revealed and are fulfilled by those who are called perfect. Those who are not perfect in the unconceived Father, which is this idea of, again, the All-Father, above Pista Sophia, above everything. The unconceived Father from which all creation comes. Those who are not perfected in the unconceived Father will receive their glories in their realms and in the kingdoms of immortals. In the kingdoms of immortals. But they will not enter the kingless realm. For it is necessary, and this last sentence is key for every individual person if you're following a Gnostic process. For it is necessary that everyone enter the place from which he has come. Each by his deeds and his gnosis will reveal his nature. Now, that last sentence speaks volumes. The idea that each person, myself, or you, the viewer at home, or any other person, how close you get to God is contingent upon your effort. And in a lot of ways, this flies in the face of Christian Orthodoxy, because it's said that by no effort can one get to heaven. It is only by the grace of the sacrifice of Jesus dying. The Gnostics rejected this idea, and they said, no, when we achieve gnosis and we grow in this gnosis, it is the impetus that moves us closer towards God. And the more effort one puts into it, the more gnosis one cultivates, the more gnosis that one draws to self, the closer one comes to God. And when this darkness is finally obliterated, when humanity reaches it's almost like a hive, kind of like a hive mind thing. I know that sounds way science fiction-y, but it's interesting that the Gnostics were talking about this idea 2,000 plus years ago, that humanity had to reach a critical mass inside the body of itself for us to be able to connect with God again and obliterate the darkness. But again, that's the totality of the whole. But it's the individuals that make up the totality of the whole. Myself and you, the individual who's watching the show, and any other person that seeks the Gnostic process. When you seek gnosis and you try to wake up and you try to grow and you try to become a light unto the world, is what Jesus had said, you are doing your part for the totality of humanity, so that humanity might eventually one day go back home from which they came. Again, it covers the idea of like an ascent, because reincarnation, the idea is firmly fixed within the Gnostic religious belief system. All of our consciousnesses, yours and mine and anyone else's, came from a particular place, and we fell. And now we're waking up again, and we're cultivating gnosis so that we might grow into a light again, so that we might cleave to God. The Kabbalistic in their mysticism says that, again, it's shattered pieces of God. It's like we're kernels of the divine. It's like a mirror. If they likened God to like a mirror beyond measure that's shattered into billions upon billions of shards. And every one of us has a shard of that divine light inside of us. the Gnostics seem to approach that idea and say that spark of divine light has to be nurtured so that it grows. So that it goes from a small light to a large light to a larger light to a larger light to a larger light until one reaches the Christ consciousness. Now, for the Gnostics, it seems that everything that Jesus said pointed in this particular direction. And they created a version of the core of Jesus' teaching, where Orthodox Christianity created a core of what they thought was the root of Jesus' teaching, which is, again, the sacrificial, dying on the cross, accepting this graceful gift to get back into heaven because we're born inherently flawed because of sin, and how the word sin is defined. So it's really interesting. I found this last section in this Origins of the World in a lot of ways very enlightening, because they kind of went into better detail in explaining some of the core fundamental beliefs of how the Gnostics saw things. So they were able to construct an overall story of like everything that Jesus said, and it seems at least in my opinion, it was closer to seamless than it was in the Orthodox interpretation. When all the things are taken together that was said and done inside of Jesus' ministry, whether they happened or not, it's the premises behind them are what's really important. There are a lot of people, I think, that waste a lot of time trying to, let's say, for instance, you can find plenty of YouTube videos out there about historic evidence for Noah's flood, or historic evidence for the fact that Sodom and Gomorrah had existed, or historic evidence that the walls of Jericho were found, and they say that if you could prove that these things actually happened, or these things actually existed, then the story in the Bible is historically accurate. And I think it's beside the point. It's not necessarily that Jesus did all these particular miracles. It's the context of what he was saying. The potentiality inside of all of us, from where we come and which way we're going. Now, I know there's a couple of premises that one has to accept before they can say move forward with Jesus as the Bodhisattva or Jesus as a teacher. One would be the idea that we have a consciousness that continues after shuffling off this mortal coil, as it were. And the body is no more than a vessel for the eternal consciousness. One has to agree upon that idea first before they might say that much of what Jesus says is no more than good advice for being nice to each other. But I guess one of the main points, and going back to, is particularly here, again, with the Gnostic Gospels, there was a man that lived 2,000 years ago, and it's not necessarily clear that the one version that survived is the version that was necessarily wholly accurate in interpreting the core of his teachings. And much of what I'm finding in the Gnostic Gospels, for me at least, is proof positive of that. And I leave it up to the viewer at home. Again, if orthodoxy is what pulls your heart and gives you faith, and following the Christian orthodoxy and the blood of Jesus as personal Savior, that's where you are. It gives you peace. Follow it in peace. The Gnostics talk about the idea of self-exploration and self-growth. And for a lot of people, that has a strong, strong appeal, that one might grow into God and become the Christ consciousness. Again, at the root of the show for why we do Nate Sutan is the idea that we explore the ideas and leave it to the viewer to decide what really clicks or resonates with them as you might move forward. This section is done, and actually I've only got a few minutes left. I'm going to be going into something called perhaps a paraphrase of Shem in the next show, and then really interesting, because we've been over it in previous shows, there is a Hermetic section. There are Hermetic Gnosticism section. Now, we've done a show on Hermetics before, and I just thought it was really interesting that they were included in the Nag Hammadi library, and there's some Hermetic aspects inside of the Gnostic Gospels. So I hope you'll join me for our next show. I'm Mark. Again, thank you for joining me. Hopefully my co-host JC will be able to join us again in the near future. And again, we have our videos on Facebook, and or I don't know, it's Facebook or YouTube. If you have any questions or comments or criticisms, please, you can go and you can find them on YouTube, some of our videos. Leave them with myself or JC, and we'll try and get back to you, and perhaps you can start a rapport, have a conversation. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Nate Sutan, and hope you join me for the next episode. Good night.